I spent many summers working as a camp counselor when I was in my early 20s. Looking back now, those years were some of the most meaningful times of my life. When I was younger, I made a lot of mistakes. I often found myself in trouble, and a big part of that came from growing up without anyone to guide me in the right direction. I never really had a strong role model to show me what kind of person I could become. That was one of the reasons I loved being a counselor. Being surrounded by nature, away from the chaos of everyday life, gave me a chance to become the person I wish I had known when I was younger. I wanted to be someone the kids could look up to. Someone who could encourage them, protect them, and maybe help them avoid some of the mistakes I made. For years, working at the camp felt almost like a second home. I had countless unforgettable memories with the campers, and most of them were positive. But every once in a while, something would happen that would remind me that even the safest places can hide things we do not understand. This particular incident happened during the summer of 2019. By that point, I had already been working at the camp for 5 years. I knew the property, I knew the routines, and I considered myself experienced enough to handle almost anything a group of teenagers could throw at me. Each counselor was assigned their own group of campers. We were responsible for them around the clock, almost like teachers watching over a classroom. My group consisted of 12 teenagers. The camp itself was different from the ones you usually see in movies. There were no huge wooden cabins filled with dozens of kids sleeping side by side. Instead, the living areas were designed more like small houses, almost like a preview of what life in a college dorm might feel like. When you entered the building, you walked into a large common area. There was a television, a large wraparound couch, a small kitchenette, and enough space for everyone to gather at night. A hallway extended from the common room and led to 3 separate bedrooms. Each bedroom had 4 beds. My own room was located across from the campers on the opposite side of the common area. It was a setup that allowed the kids to have some independence while still making sure a counselor was nearby if anything happened. At least that was the idea. One morning, one of my campers approached me, looking exhausted. He told me he had barely slept because he kept hearing someone walking around during the night. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was probably just another camper getting up to use the bathroom or someone moving around after lights out. Teenagers love messing with each other, and I figured maybe someone was trying to scare him. I told him not to worry and promised I would pay attention that night, but he looked genuinely disturbed. He told me it wasn't just a one-time thing. He had heard the footsteps for 2 nights in a row, not just a few steps. He said the walking continued throughout the entire night. I still tried to reassure him. I told him I would handle it and that there was nothing to be afraid of. Deep down, I believed there had to be a normal explanation. That night before everyone went to bed, all the campers were gathered in the common room. I decided to make an announcement. I reminded them that once the lights were turned off, everyone was expected to remain in their rooms. If they needed the bathroom, they could go, but there was absolutely no wandering around the house. Most of them just stared back at me with the typical teenage expression of someone who wasn't really listening, but they all nodded and agreed. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A little before 1:00 the morning, I was suddenly jolted awake by screaming. Not normal screaming. Terrified screaming. The kind of screaming that instantly makes your body react before your mind even understands what is happening. I jumped out of bed and rushed toward the camper's room. When I opened the door and turned on the light, the scene in front of me immediately told me something was seriously wrong. All 4 teenagers were awake. They looked completely frozen. Their faces were pale, their eyes were wide, and one of them was crying uncontrollably. I asked what happened. For several seconds, nobody said anything. Then one of them slowly lifted his hand and pointed toward the corner of the room near the closet. The camper who had spoken to me earlier about the footsteps finally found his voice. He told me he had woken up and saw something standing there. A figure. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. Maybe it was just a shadow caused by something in the room. Maybe he was half asleep, so he tried to ignore it. He closed his eyes and tried to go back to sleep, but then he heard it. Heavy breathing. Slow, deep, close. That was when he knew something was wrong. The room was dark and he couldn't clearly see what all he could make out was a dark shape blocking part of the closet doorway. It looked like a person standing completely still. Instead of screaming immediately, he woke up his roommates. One by one, they opened their eyes, and one by one, they saw it too. The camper who was crying believed it had to be a prank. He thought one of the other campers was hiding in their room trying to scare them, so he decided to prove it. He got out of bed and slowly walked toward the figure. The moment he moved closer, the figure moved. It suddenly rushed out of the room. The door slammed shut behind it. That was the moment all 4 of them screamed. I asked the camper who approached it if he got a good look at whoever it was. He shook his head, but he said one thing with absolute certainty. It was tall. Very tall. Too tall to be another teenager. At that point, I still wasn't ready to accept that something strange had happened. My brain kept searching for a logical explanation. I told the campers to stay in their beds while I checked the building. The other 2 rooms had already been awakened by the noise. They were asking what was happening, but I told them to stay inside and not come out. I walked through the entire house. I checked every room, every corner, every possible hiding place. But I found nothing. No person. No sign of anyone breaking in. The front door was still locked. The windows showed no obvious damage. There was no mud, dirt, or grass on the floor that would suggest someone had entered from outside. Eventually, I managed to calm everyone down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to stay in the common room for a while, partly because I was wide awake and partly because I wanted to catch whoever was responsible if this really was some kind of prank. I sat there reading, listening carefully to every sound around me. Eventually, exhaustion started to take over. I wasn't fully asleep when I heard it. A sound from the hallway. A slow creaking. The wooden floor bending under someone's weight. I immediately sat up. At first I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, but then I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, real. There was no doubt. Someone was walking down the hallway. I stood up quietly and moved toward the sound. I didn't turn on the lights. I still believed this was another camper playing some kind of elaborate prank, and I wanted to catch them in the act. I expected to see a teenager standing there, terrified that their joke had gone too far. But what I saw made my entire body freeze. At the end of the hallway, standing in front of an open window, was a figure. A tall figure. I couldn't see its face. I couldn't see any details. Only a dark silhouette against the faint light coming from outside. But I knew immediately this was not one of the campers. The figure was standing beside the same bedroom door where it appeared earlier. One hand was resting on the doorknob. I stood there completely frozen. My mind was racing. Every possible explanation disappeared one by one. Then the figure slowly released the doorknob and turned toward me. I have never experienced fear like that moment. I couldn't see its eyes. I couldn't see its face. But somehow I knew it was looking directly at me. My legs felt weak. My entire body felt numb. It was as if every instinct inside me was screaming that something was terribly wrong. The figure was even taller than I first realized. Its head almost reached the top of the doorway. The way it stood, the way it moved, the way it watched me, everything about it felt unnatural. I expected it to run toward me. I expected it to attack, but it didn't. It just stood there, silent, motionless. For what felt like several minutes, the only sound was its breathing, heavy, slow, disturbing. Then without warning it moved, not like a normal person. Its movement was strange and almost unpredictable. It stepped backward through the open window, and then it disappeared into the darkness outside. I didn't wait. I immediately called the person in charge of the camp and told him to contact the police. He did as soon as we ended the call. Several counselors who were not responsible for staying with the campers searched the surrounding woods. They looked everywhere, behind trees, around the buildings, along the trails, but they found nothing. When the police arrived, I explained everything that had happened. I told them about the footsteps, the figure in the bedroom, the shadow standing in the hallway, the way it disappeared through the window, but there wasn't much they could do. A description like a very tall, shadowy figure wasn't enough for them to identify or locate anyone. I remember feeling like the camp should have been shut down immediately. After what happened, I didn't feel comfortable knowing that someone or something had been inside that building. But the campers and their parents believed it was safe to continue. So the summer camp continued. Everyone tried to move on. But even years later, I still think about that night, because I spent 5 years believing I knew every sound that place could make. I knew every room, every hallway, every corner of that camp, and yet on that night something was there that I could not explain. Something that walked through the darkness, something that watched those children while they slept, and something that vanished before anyone could discover what it really was. The camp owners took what happened extremely seriously after that night. They knew that something had gone terribly wrong and they refused to take any more chances. They hired several off-duty police officers to stay around the property and act as security for the remainder of the summer. Before anyone else stayed in those cabins, every single door and window across the entire camp was checked. That was when we discovered something that honestly shocked me. Almost every window in the camp had been left unlocked. I still remember how uncomfortable that realization made me feel. After everything that happened, knowing that someone could have entered so easily made my stomach turn. The first thing I did when I finally returned home was walk through my house and check every single window and door to make sure they were locked. Looking back, I know the situation could have ended much worse. That figure could have hurt one of the campers. It could have hurt me. But somehow everyone walked away physically unharmed, and for that, I am grateful. But the image of that figure never left me. I still think about the fear on those kids' faces. I still wonder how terrifying it must have been for them to wake up in the middle of the night and see something standing in their room. They were just teenagers. They were supposed to be worrying about making friends, having fun, and enjoying their summer. Instead, they experienced something that most people would struggle to believe. And the worst part is that we never found out the truth. There was never an explanation. No suspect. No answers. No proof of who or what that figure was. I have no idea where it came from. I have no idea what it wanted. And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, why did it choose that specific room? Why those campers? Why did it return to the exact same place twice? Those questions have stayed with me ever since. Sometimes not knowing the truth is far more frightening than knowing something terrible happened. Because when there is no answer, your mind fills in the blanks. And some of those possibilities are much worse than reality. That uncertainty is something I believe I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Years later, I still find myself thinking about that night. About the footsteps. About the breathing. About the impossible figure standing silently in the hallway. Some things happen that you can explain, and some things happen that simply refuse to be explained. This is another story that I still struggle to understand. When I was in high school, my parents forced me to attend a religious summer camp. At the time, I hated the idea. I wasn't an outdoors person. I wasn't interested in camping. I would much rather spend my summer sitting inside playing video games, watching movies, or hanging out with my friends around the neighborhood. The thought of spending days surrounded by trees, bugs, and strangers sounded like a punishment. But my parents had a different idea. They wanted me to get outside. They wanted me to experience something new. They hoped I would make friends and maybe become a little more open to the world beyond my bedroom. I didn't realize it at the time, but that decision would lead me to one of the strangest and most terrifying experiences of my life. An experience that I still cannot explain to this day. When I first arrived at the camp, I spent the first few days just trying to adjust. I learned everyone's names, got familiar with the layout of the property, and figured out the daily schedule. Surprisingly, it wasn't as bad as I expected. In fact, I started enjoying myself. The camp was actually pretty fun, and as a 5-year-old boy, there was one detail that made the experience even better. The camp was co-ed. Naturally, I started doing what most teenage boys would do. I tried to impress the girls. There was one girl in particular who caught my attention. Her name was Jenny. I started looking for excuses to be around her. I would choose activities based on what she was doing, find reasons to join conversations she was part of, and basically spend my days trying to get her attention. Jenny was different from most of the other campers. She was fascinated by supernatural stories. She loved anything mysterious or unexplained. Her favorite part of camp was gathering around the fire at night and listening to ghost stories. Personally, I found it strange that a religious summer camp would even allow stories like that. But nobody seemed to mind. And one night everything changed. We were all sitting around the campfire when one of the counselors decided to tell us a story. He told us about a small cabin located a short walk away from the main camp area. The cabin was abandoned. Nobody stayed there. Nobody used it. It just sat alone in the woods, separated from the rest of the camp. According to the counselor, something horrible had happened there many years earlier. He didn't tell us exactly what happened. He didn't give us names. He didn't explain the details. But the way he told the story made it clear that whatever happened had been disturbing. He described it as something evil. Then he continued with the rumors. People claimed they had seen strange figures moving behind the windows late at night. Some said they heard voices and unexplained noises coming from inside the empty cabin. Others claimed they felt like they were being watched whenever they got close to it. Then came the part that caught everyone's attention. The counselor said there was a story about a camper who had gone near the cabin one night and was never seen again. The entire group went silent. The fire cracked and popped as everyone stared into the darkness surrounding us. Then suddenly the counselor screamed. He jumped forward, trying to scare everyone. It worked, at least for half the group. A few people laughed, but others immediately jumped up and started complaining that he had gone too far. Eventually, everyone started leaving. Everyone except Jenny. She stayed behind. She looked genuinely curious and asked the counselor one question. Did a camper really disappear? The counselor smiled and admitted the truth. No, it was just a camp legend. A story they told older campers to make the abandoned cabin seem more mysterious. He said he didn't believe the cabin was haunted. He said there was no proof anything strange had ever happened there. But even after he explained that the story stayed in everyone's minds, we all started talking about it. Some people believed the abandoned cabin was left there intentionally. Maybe the camp owners knew the story made the place more interesting. Maybe having an empty, creepy building hidden in the woods gave the legend a little more credibility. Because when you can actually see the place from the story, when there is a real cabin sitting there exactly as described, it becomes much easier to believe. At least that's what people like Jenny thought. Eventually, the counselor gathered everyone together and told us it was time to return to our cabins for the night. But what he didn't know was that a few of us already had another plan. A small group of campers had decided we were going to sneak out later and play truth or dare. Jenny was part of the group. We waited. We made sure the counselors had returned to their rooms. We waited until the camp became completely quiet. Then, one by one, we slipped outside. There were 8 of us in total. 5 boys arrived first. A few minutes later, the 3 girls joined us. We walked down toward the water far enough away from the cabins that nobody would hear us. The walk took around 10 minutes. The woods were completely dark. The kind of darkness where every small sound feels louder than it should. Every branch cracking, every movement in the trees, every strange noise in the distance. But at that moment we were teenagers. We weren't thinking about danger. We were thinking about having fun. We sat by the water for a while and started playing truth or dare. I was secretly hoping for a chance to impress Jenny. At first, everyone avoided choosing dare. Nobody wanted to do anything embarrassing or scary. Most people chose truth, but eventually it was my turn. I wanted to seem confident. I wanted to prove I wasn't afraid, so I chose dare. I should have known what was coming. The group immediately smiled. They already had something planned. They dared me to go inside the abandoned cabin, and not just walk inside. They wanted me to stay there alone, for 10 full minutes. I looked over at Jenny. For the first time that night, she wasn't smiling. She looked genuinely afraid, but I didn't want to back down. I didn't believe the story. I didn't believe in ghosts. I thought it was just another camp legend designed to scare kids, so I agreed. The 8 of us quietly made our way through the woods toward the abandoned cabin, but as we got closer, something changed. The jokes became quieter. The laughter disappeared. Nobody said it out loud, but we all felt it. There was something unsettling about that place. Something about the air around the cabin felt wrong. The closer we got, the heavier the silence became. And standing there in front of that old abandoned building, I began to wonder if the story we heard around the campfire was really just a story after all. I think the reason the cabin felt different that night was because of the story we had just heard. Everyone had that legend fresh in their minds. Even though most of us claimed we didn't believe it, the human mind has a strange way of holding on to frightening ideas. Once someone plants a terrifying thought in your head, especially in a dark forest at night, even the smallest sound can start to feel like proof that something is there. But honestly, at the beginning, I wasn't really afraid of ghosts. I was more afraid of getting caught. I was a 15-year-old kid sneaking out of my cabin in the middle of the night. I was breaking camp rules, and now I was about to break into an abandoned building that I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near. That was what scared me. Not the ghost story. Not the rumors. Just the possibility of getting caught and having to explain myself. At least that was what I told myself. I walked toward the cabin while the others stayed behind. When I reached the door, I stopped and looked back. Everyone was hiding behind the trees, watching me. I could see their faces in the darkness. Some were smiling. Some looked nervous. And Jenny, she looked like she genuinely hoped I would turn around and walk back. I turned back toward the cabin and reached for the door. That's when I noticed something strange. The door was already open. I had expected to have to force it. I thought I would have to push against a stuck lock or climb through a broken window. But no, the entrance was just there, waiting. I remember thinking how strange that was. An abandoned cabin in the middle of the woods, supposedly untouched for years, and the door wasn't even locked. But I ignored the feeling. I stepped inside. Then I slowly closed the door behind me. The moment it shut, the outside world seemed to disappear. The sounds of my friends faded away. The wind disappeared. The forest became silent. Inside the cabin was almost completely dark. The moonlight barely came through the dirty windows, creating faint patches of light across the old wooden floor. The air smelled ancient. It had that heavy, forgotten smell of a place that hadn't been used in years. Old wood, dust, moisture, decay. It felt like walking into somewhere that had been abandoned and left behind by everyone. And the strangest thing was the temperature. It was cold, much colder than it should have been. I walked slowly through the cabin, looking around and trying to make the 10 minutes pass as quickly as possible. I wasn't searching for ghosts. I wasn't looking for anything supernatural. I just wanted the time to end so I could leave and pretend none of this had happened. Then I heard it. A creak behind me. I stopped immediately. The sound was unmistakable. It sounded like someone stepping on an old wooden floor. Slowly, carefully. I turned around. Nothing. The cabin was empty. I stood there for a moment trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe the old wood was shifting. Maybe the cabin was settling. Maybe my own footsteps had caused the sound. It didn't really make sense. But when you're a scared teenager standing alone inside an abandoned cabin, your brain will accept almost any explanation that makes you feel safer. I looked down at my watch. Only 2 minutes had passed. That shocked me. It felt like I had already been inside for 20 minutes. I decided to stop walking around and just wait. In the center of the cabin was a large wooden support beam. I leaned against it and tried to calm myself. For a while, nothing happened. Then, the creaking started again. This time, it was closer. I looked around. Nothing. No movement. No person. No explanation. Then the sound changed. The creaks became louder, faster, more aggressive. It sounded like someone was running across the wooden floor, but there was nobody there. The sound moved through the cabin as if someone was sprinting around me, left, right, behind me. Then suddenly, silence. Complete silence. I looked at my watch. Only 1 more minute had passed. 1 minute? That was all, but it felt impossible. I walked toward the window and looked outside, hoping to see my friends. I needed to know I wasn't alone. I searched the area where they had been standing. Nothing. The trees were empty. I couldn't see anyone. At first, I thought they were hiding to make the prank more convincing, so I put my hands around my eyes and pressed against the glass, trying to get a better look. Still nothing. I started knocking on the window, quietly at first, then harder. I waited for someone to laugh. I waited for someone to jump out and scare me. Nobody came. Nobody responded. That was when the fear finally started becoming real. I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to believe it. But something about that cabin felt wrong. Maybe it was the story. Maybe it was the darkness. Maybe it was the way my friends had reacted earlier. Whatever it was, I no longer wanted to stay. I decided I was leaving. I figured everyone would make fun of me afterward anyway. I walked back toward the door. I grabbed the handle and pulled. Nothing happened. I pulled harder. Still nothing. For a second I thought maybe I had accidentally locked it when I came inside. But then I looked closely. There wasn't even a lock. The door didn't have any way to lock from the inside. My mind started racing. Maybe it was just stuck. Old wood. Humidity. Something simple. I grabbed the handle with both hands and forced it. Nothing. I slammed my shoulder into the door. Nothing. Again. Nothing. The door wouldn't move. And then I heard it. The sounds inside the cabin started again, but this time they were different. The footsteps were everywhere, not one direction. Every direction, around me. The noise echoed through the cabin like something was moving faster than a person should be able to move. My heart was pounding. Every instinct inside me was telling me that I wasn't alone. And then I felt it. A presence. Right behind me. I can't explain how I knew. I never saw anyone. I never heard breathing. But every part of my body reacted as if someone was standing inches away from my back. Something dark. Something threatening. Something that didn't belong there. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. Fear can make you believe impossible things. But I couldn't turn around. I physically couldn't. My body refused. I started pounding on the door. I screamed for help. I screamed my friends' names. Then I heard something. Someone on the other side of the door. Someone was pulling on it, trying to open it. They were struggling too. Then I heard a voice. It was Jenny. She was there. I had thought everyone had left me. I thought they had abandoned me as part of the prank. But Jenny was still outside. She was trying to get the door open. She shouted that it was stuck. She told me everyone was trying to help, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was focused on one thing, the feeling behind me. I was still facing the door. I still couldn't turn around. And then I felt it. Something close to my shoulder. A breath. Cold air against my skin. I froze. I couldn't hear anyone breathing. I couldn't see anyone standing there, but I knew. Somehow, I knew something was behind me. I let go of the doorknob. My strength disappeared. I dropped to the floor and leaned my back against the door. At that moment, I had already accepted that I wasn't getting out. I was completely helpless. Then suddenly, the door opened. I fell backward out of the cabin. The cold night air hit me. Jenny and the others grabbed me and pulled me away from the entrance. Everyone was talking at once. Everyone was asking what happened, but I couldn't answer. Because as I looked back at the abandoned cabin, I realized something that still bothers me to this day. The door was open, just like when I first arrived. Nothing was there. No person. No shadow. No explanation. but I will never forget the feeling of standing inside that cabin, knowing something was behind me, and knowing that whatever it was, it didn't want me to leave. The moment the door opened, I fell backward onto the ground. For a few seconds, I couldn't even process what I was seeing. Standing outside the cabin were two camp counselors. I have never felt relief like that in my entire life. After everything that had happened inside that cabin, seeing actual people standing there felt like being pulled out of a nightmare. I immediately scrambled away from the doorway and ran. I didn't care how ridiculous I looked. I didn't care that my friends were watching. I didn't care that I had failed the challenge. I just wanted to be away from that place. I collapsed on the ground outside the cabin and started thanking the counselors for getting me out. But their reaction wasn't what I expected. They weren't laughing. They weren't teasing me. They didn't look amused at all. They looked angry. They immediately brought me back to the main cabin, and for the rest of the night, I basically spent my time in what I can only describe as the summer camp version of solitary confinement. I was separated from everyone else. No hanging out. No talking with my friends. Just sitting there alone and waiting for morning. At that point, I honestly didn't even care about getting in trouble. I was still trying to process what had happened. The cabin, the footsteps, the feeling that something was standing behind me. No punishment could have scared me more than what I had already experienced. The next morning, I was called into a meeting with the woman who ran the camp. I sat across from her and explained everything. I told her about the sounds. I told her about the door. I told her how it felt like something was inside that cabin with me. But as I talked, I noticed something. She didn't seem concerned. In fact, she kept rolling her eyes. She told me that the counselors were not supposed to tell campers that story anymore because it caused unnecessary fear and gave kids nightmares. According to her, the abandoned cabin story was nothing more than a camp legend, a made-up story, something created over the years to scare older campers. She assured me there was nothing real behind it. But what bothered me most was that she didn't seem interested in what I had experienced. It felt like she had already decided what happened before I even finished explaining. Eventually, she called my parents. I was sent home. I was kicked out of the camp for 3 reasons: breaking curfew, sneaking out after lights out, and entering a restricted building. Normally, I would have been devastated, but honestly, I was relieved. I didn't care that my summer was over. I didn't care that I was going to spend the rest of my vacation grounded. I was just happy to be leaving. I wanted to be somewhere familiar, somewhere safe, somewhere that didn't have an abandoned cabin hidden in the woods. After I got home, I remember trying to research the story. Back then, the internet wasn't anything like it is today. There wasn't endless information available with a simple search. I tried looking for details about the cabin. I tried finding anything that could prove whether the story was real or completely fictional, but I found nothing. No articles, no records, no history, nothing. Years passed. The camp eventually closed down. Every once in a while, I would search again, hoping I would finally find some explanation, but I never did. The strangest part is that people often tell me it was probably just my imagination, that maybe fear caused me to hear things, that maybe the story got into my head and I convinced myself something was happening. But I know that wasn't the case. I don't scare easily. I have experienced plenty of creepy situations in my life, and nothing has ever affected me the way that cabin did. That was the only time I have ever felt genuine, overwhelming fear, the kind of fear that takes control of your body before your mind can even react. And to this day, it remains the only experience in my life that I truly cannot explain. I have heard old wooden floors creak before. I have walked through buildings that were hundreds of years old. I have heard wood shift and settle, but nothing has ever sounded like those footsteps. They weren't random. They weren't natural. They were too deliberate, too controlled. Almost like something was moving around inside that cabin and wanted me to know it was there. I've always told myself that someday I would drive back to that area. I would find out whether the cabin still exists, and if it does, maybe I would go inside again. Maybe I would give that 10 minutes another chance. Maybe I would finally prove to myself that it was nothing. Or maybe I would discover that whatever happened that night was never just a story. Who knows? Maybe this time, I would actually make it through the full 10 minutes. But that wasn't the only strange thing to ever happen at a summer camp. My own family has operated a summer camp for teenagers for more than 40 years. My parents still technically own the camp, but as they have gotten older, they have slowly stepped away from the daily responsibilities. For the past few years, most of the operations have fallen on me. I organize activities. I manage schedules. I make sure everything runs smoothly. Our camp operates 3 separate 12-day sessions every summer. The final day of each session is always a Friday. After that, the campers leave and the staff gets 2 days to prepare before the next group arrives on Monday. At least that's how it works for everyone else. The employees get a 2-day break. I don't. I usually stay behind. Someone has to make sure the camp is cleaned, repaired, and ready for the next group of kids. But one summer, something happened that forced us to cancel our final session completely. It started on the last day of our second session. After breakfast, one of the girls came up to me. She seemed relieved. She told me she was happy to be going home. Whenever I hear a camper say that, it always bothers me. A summer camp is supposed to be a place where kids create memories, make friends, and have fun. So hearing someone say they couldn't wait to leave usually means something went wrong. I asked her what happened. She told me she hadn't slept well for the past 2 nights. She said she was just looking forward to sleeping in her own room again. I asked her why she wasn't sleeping, and that's when she told me something I never expected to hear. She said she was being bothered by an owl man. At first, I honestly didn't know how to respond. I wasn't sure if she was joking. I wasn't sure if she was describing a nightmare. I wasn't sure if she was just using her imagination, because an owl man sounds like something from a strange horror movie, not something a child would casually describe during breakfast. I asked her what she meant. She told me she first saw him 2 nights earlier. She said she was sleeping when she heard something tapping on her window, a soft tapping, repeatedly. She woke up and looked toward the glass. Standing outside was something she called the Owl Man. She described him as a figure with owl-like features. She said he was just standing there, watching her. Then she said something even stranger. She claimed he was waving at her. She convinced herself it was a dream. She told herself she was half asleep, so she closed her eyes and tried to go back to sleep. But the following night, the tapping happened again. Same window, same sound. This time she knew she wasn't dreaming. She got up and walked closer. And according to her, the owl man spoke. He asked her if she could let him inside because he was cold. She told him she wasn't allowed to open the window. She told him to go away. Then she said the figure made a sad sound and disappeared into the forest. The strange thing was her reaction while telling me the story. She wasn't terrified. She wasn't panicking. She didn't even seem afraid. She just looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept properly in days. I made sure she was okay. She said she was fine. Eventually, we went our separate ways. I decided to dismiss it. I told myself it was just a vivid dream, a child's imagination, a strange combination of exhaustion and fear. Because honestly, what else could it be? An owl man. It sounded impossible. The campers eventually left. The camp became quiet again, and I began preparing everything for the next session that was supposed to start that Monday. Cleaning, checking supplies, fixing small problems. Just normal preparation. At least that's what I thought, because I had no idea that the strange story that girl told me was only the beginning. For the rest of the afternoon, I tried my best to ignore what was happening. Every now and then I would hear something strange coming from somewhere around the property. A noise from the woods, a movement outside one of the buildings, a sound that I couldn't quite identify, but I kept telling myself the same thing. I was alone. Nobody else was supposed to be there. The camp was surrounded by miles of forest, and when you're in a place like that, strange sounds are normal. Animals move through the trees. Branches fall. The wind creates noises that can sound like something much closer than it actually is, so I ignored it. At least I tried to. That night, I stayed behind at the camp to finish paperwork and prepare activities for the next group of campers who would arrive on Monday. The entire property felt different without the kids there. Usually the camp was filled with voices, laughter, music, people walking around. But that night, everything was completely silent. The kind of silence that makes you notice every little sound. I sat alone at my desk, surrounded by paperwork, schedules, and planning notes. But even while I worked, I kept hearing noises outside. Every few minutes, something would catch my attention. I would stop writing, look up, listen, then slowly glance toward the windows. But every single time, nothing. Just darkness. Our camp is located deep in the woods, so I knew there were plenty of explanations. A deer walking nearby, a raccoon searching for food, some animal moving around the property. It wasn't impossible, but as the hours passed, I started feeling uneasy. There was something about the timing of the noises. They didn't feel random. They felt like something was moving around the camp, watching, waiting. Eventually, I decided it was time to relax. I had been working all day and I was exhausted. I sat down in my chair, leaned back, and finally put my feet up. That was when the entire room suddenly lit up. A bright flash of light came through the blinds. I immediately sat up. My first thought was that someone was outside. I stood up and looked toward the window. The light was coming from the motion sensor floodlight attached to the side of the building. It had turned on. I stared outside. Nothing. No person. No animal. Nothing moving. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just an animal passing by, but then I remembered something important. That floodlight was not overly sensitive. It didn't turn on because a small animal walked nearby. A raccoon wouldn't activate it. A rabbit wouldn't activate it. Something large enough to trigger the sensor had to be out there, and that thought bothered me a lot. I stepped away from the window and started walking back toward my chair. I didn't even make it halfway. That's when I heard it, a scratching sound, coming from the front door. I froze. At first I wondered if I had imagined it. Then I heard it again, scratching, slow, repeated, deliberate. I called out, "Is anyone out there?" No answer. Only the scratching continued. That was when I started thinking maybe it really was an animal. Maybe something had gotten curious and was trying to get inside. But even that explanation didn't feel right. The animals around the camp were used to people. They stayed away from the cabins. They never acted this aggressively. They never tried to force their way inside. I walked toward the front door more annoyed than afraid. I raised my fist and slammed it against the wooden door. The sound echoed through the building. "Get away." For a moment, everything went silent. The scratching stopped. I stood there listening, trying to figure out what was outside. I pressed closer to the door. I wanted to hear movement, anything that would tell me what animal was out there. Then I heard something else, something that made my entire body go cold. Footsteps. Not scratching, not an animal moving around. Footsteps. The unmistakable sound of someone walking down the wooden stairs leading to the front entrance. My mind went blank. For a few seconds I couldn't move. Every explanation I had been holding on to disappeared. Animals don't walk downstairs. They don't step carefully onto wooden steps. Something was outside. Something that sounded like a person. I stood there frozen, trying to convince myself I was wrong. After several seconds, I finally forced myself to move. There was a small window beside the front door. I slowly walked toward it. My heart was pounding. I expected to see someone standing there. Maybe a person in the driveway. Maybe someone watching the house. But when I looked outside, there was nothing, only darkness. The driveway was empty. The woods were completely still. I reached over and turned on the outdoor light above the entrance. The area immediately brightened. Again, nothing. No person. No animal. No movement. Just an empty yard. I turned the light back off and returned to my chair. I sat there in silence, trying to make sense of everything. After a while, I started talking myself out of it. Maybe I had misunderstood the sound. Maybe the footsteps weren't footsteps. Maybe an animal had caused everything. It was the only explanation that made sense. And sometimes when something frightening happens, your brain desperately searches for the most logical answer because accepting the alternative is much harder. A few more hours passed. Nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I fell asleep in my chair. I don't know how long I was asleep. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. But suddenly, a loud crash exploded from the back of the house. I woke up instantly. My heart was racing. I jumped out of the chair completely alert. The first thing I noticed was the light. The motion sensor floodlight was on again, but this time it was shining through the back windows. I slowly turned toward the sound. The scratching was gone. Instead, I heard tapping, soft tapping, coming from the back of the house. More specifically, from the glass sliding door that led to the back deck. I stood completely still. There were curtains covering the door, so I couldn't see what was outside. The only thing I could hear was that tapping, a slow, steady rhythm against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. At first, it was quiet, almost polite, but then it became louder, more noticeable, like whatever was outside wanted me to know it was there. I slowly walked toward the sliding door. Every step felt heavier than the last. The closer I got, the louder the tapping became. I reached the curtains. My hand hovered inches away from them. I knew I had to look. I knew I needed to know what was outside, but something inside me was warning me not to. Because deep down, I already felt like I knew what I was going to see. I finally reached the curtains. For a few seconds, I just stood there. My hand was inches away from the fabric. The tapping continued. Slow, steady, high, patient. Something was on the other side of that glass door. Something that wanted my attention. I don't know why, but I already had a terrible feeling about what I was about to see. I slowly grabbed the edge of the curtain. Then I pulled it open, and my entire body froze. Standing just a few feet away from the sliding glass door was a man, but he wasn't dressed normally. He was wearing a bright white owl mask. The mask covered his entire face, large dark eyes, a strange beak-like shape, an expression that looked completely emotionless. He was standing there in the darkness staring directly at me, and he was still tapping on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. The way he moved, his hand almost looked like he was waving, like he was trying to get my attention, like he was greeting me. But there was something deeply disturbing about it, because there was nothing friendly about the situation. A grown man wearing an owl mask was standing outside my isolated cabin in the middle of the woods, at night, alone. My first reaction was panic, pure panic. I started shouting. I don't even remember exactly what I said. I just remember the fear taking over. I yelled for him to leave. I yelled for him to get away from the door, but my voice didn't sound normal. The words barely came out. It was more like a frightened, broken attempt to speak, almost like my brain knew something was wrong before I could fully understand it. The strangest part was his reaction. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't look surprised. He didn't seem angry. He just kept tapping, like my fear meant nothing to him, like he had expected this reaction. Then after a few moments the tapping stopped, and we just stood there, separated by a thin sheet of glass, looking at each other. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I was frozen. Then the owl man reached forward. He grabbed the handle of the sliding door and tried to open it. Thankfully, I had locked it. The door moved slightly, but it didn't open. That small click of the locked door is something I will never forget, because in that moment, the only thing standing between me and that person was a simple lock. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, almost polite. He asked me if I could please open the door. He said he wanted to show me what was inside his bag. That sentence still bothers me, because there was something so wrong about it. A stranger wearing a mask, standing outside a cabin in the woods, asking me to open the door so he could show me something inside a bag. It sounded like something from a nightmare. I wanted to move. I wanted to grab something. I wanted to yell, but fear had completely taken control. It wasn't just being scared. It was like my body had shut down. I couldn't make myself move. I couldn't take my eyes off him. Finally, after what felt like forever, I managed to reach into my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped my phone. I pulled it out and immediately started dialing 911. The moment he realized what I was doing, his behavior changed. The calm voice disappeared. He told me calling the police was not a good idea. Then he warned me that it was going to make him very angry. But that didn't stop me. If anything, it confirmed that I was doing the right thing. I stayed on the phone. I told the dispatcher where I was. I explained what was happening. And while I was talking, the owl man suddenly moved. He turned around and ran. He disappeared into the forest behind the cabin. I rushed toward the window, trying to follow where he went. But within seconds, the darkness swallowed him. It was like he had vanished. No footsteps. No movement. Nothing. Just the empty woods. When the police arrived, they searched the entire area. They checked the property. They searched the surrounding forest. They looked for any sign of where he had gone, but they found nothing. No person. No vehicle. No explanation. However, they did find something. Deep in the woods, hanging from a tree branch, they discovered the owl mask, and directly underneath it, a backpack. Inside the backpack was a pink shirt. Written across the front of the shirt was the word Vermont in cursive handwriting. That detail immediately stood out, because our camp was nowhere near Vermont. Not even close. Vermont was on the opposite side of the country. There was no obvious reason why someone would have that shirt hidden deep in the woods near our camp. But the shirt wasn't the most disturbing discovery. Inside the shirt, wrapped carefully within the fabric, was a knife. Not a small pocket knife. Not something someone would carry for camping. It was a large butcher knife. The kind of knife that instantly changes the way you look at a situation. Suddenly, this wasn't just some strange person playing a disturbing prank. This was someone who had been walking around our camp with a weapon. Someone who had been near children. Someone who had tried to get inside. Even with the mask and backpack, investigators were never able to identify him. They never found out who he was. They never found out where he came from. They never discovered what he wanted. And that is what still bothers me the most. Because when you look back at everything that happened, his behavior doesn't make sense. He appeared out of nowhere. He went near a cabin where a young camper had reported seeing him. Then he came to my cabin. He tried to get inside, but he didn't force his way in. He didn't break the glass. He didn't become violent. When the camper told him to leave, he left. When I refused to open the door, he disappeared. It was almost as if he wasn't trying to break in. It was as if he was testing something, waiting for someone to let him in. That thought still makes me uncomfortable. After the police discovered the backpack and knife, we made the decision to cancel the next session. There was no way we could bring another group of children into that environment while someone like that was still possibly somewhere nearby. The public was never given the real reason. My family managed to keep the details private. That's also why I'm telling this story without revealing my real name or the name of the camp, because we still operate the camp today. And if parents knew that a person wearing an owl mask had been wandering through the woods near their children's cabins, we would never recover. The camp would be finished. Thankfully, years had passed since that night. Nothing like it has happened again. We increased security. We took extra precautions. We made sure the camp was safer than ever. But ever since that encounter, I have never been able to fully relax at night. Every sound outside makes me look up. Every movement in the woods catches my attention. A part of me is always waiting for that figure to return, waiting to see that white owl mask appear again outside a window. I hope more than anything that what happened was a one-time event, a strange and terrifying encounter that will never happen again, because somewhere out there, that person is still free, and I can only hope that wherever the owl man is today, he stays far away from this camp, and he never comes back.